I received a question this week about encounter design in Fantasy Flight Games, Star Wars role-playing, and I have to admit that question threw me a little bit. Encounter design is not something that I do, really, not in the way that the question is meant. I don't give it much thought at all, to be honest. What I do is to try to be consistent with what we see in the films. Meaning, I don't look at an encounter from the point of view of what would be easy for the group to beat, what would be difficult for the group to beat, what might entice them to surrender, what might entice them to run. I don't look at it like that. I look at it from the point of view of what should be there. That said, the game does set you up to handle this question pretty easily no matter which way you choose to come at it. So in the previous picture with our beloved rebel scum, or in this picture with our new friend, Chirrut Imwe, we have our heroes surrounded by stormtroopers, and we have two completely different responses to them. The response is entirely up to the players. Will they fight like Imwe and this rebel fleet, or will they surrender like Han, Leia, and Chewie? Sometimes surrendering in the face of superior odds just makes sense, although for some game masters this is something of a unicorn, something that they hope to encounter in the wild and yet rarely do. But not all situations are hopeless, no matter what they look like. Sometimes you just need a clever player who thinks of using tow cables instead of blasters or a laser cannon. From a certain point of view, it's not really up to the game master what will constitute a scene where surrender makes sense or fighting makes sense instead of running away. That, from my perspective, lies firmly in the hands of the players. But sometimes, well, everybody at the table feels like a fight absolutely must happen. And how do you know, as the game master, when you're just getting used to the system, if the opposition or rival or nemesis that you have created can actually do what you need them to do in that scene, like in this one with Luke and Vader? Vader's not trying to kill Luke, he's trying to defeat Luke and persuade him, capture him, shift him in some way. He has to be skillful enough not to kill Luke and get harmed in the process. How do we make those assessments? How do we judge the blockade run? How many Star Destroyers can we put in on the scene without, making it impossible? When we are faced with decisions like these and a lack of certainty, the game does step in and assist us. And the first thing it does is provide us with minions, rivals, and nemesis. Fresh out of the box with brand new player characters without any extra experience added to them, the example characters in the adversaries chapter of the core books, those minions, rivals, and nemesis are ideally suited for them. So this is all set up for the beginning game master to just play. Once your characters start earning experience and developing their abilities, they will become more of a challenge. Now, what do we do with the minions, rivals, and nemesis in that case? We have to remember that even the smallest ship, an A-Wing, can take out the Super Star Destroyer. The threat present in the game never really goes away. Characters are more fragile than they are capable. In a sense, you can think of these characters as glass cannons. So we don't have to worry as much about encounter balance as you might think. And in campaign play, we may actually spend more of our time worrying about the opposition than we will about the player characters. So, I mentioned earlier they were glass cannons, and this is, for the most part, true. The threat of injury will remain a real and present one throughout most of your play. The characters in my long-running campaign are now well over 1,000 experience points, and most of them are still pretty worried about a firefight. Our most enduring, our toughest, most hand-to-hand combat capable character is very, very tough and can narrate away an awful lot of damage in combat situations. And yet, there are still many things in the Star Wars universe that he fears from the perspective of taking damage. It's important to remember how the action sequence is set up. So in any encounter, characters are limited to a certain number of maneuvers, usually kept at 2 until we get up into signature abilities, and even then going over 2 is rare. And 1 action. This is what they can do. Now, if they get enough advantages, they might be able to get another maneuver. If you get enough despair on your check, you might provide another maneuver to the other team, which happens out of turn. However, for the most part, you're looking at 1 to 2 maneuvers and 1 action per cycle of the initiative sequence. And the initiative sequence is fluid, so a group that is learning how to coordinate well with each other and make the most of what their character abilities are from cycle to cycle will be much more effective than you might think. Again, just looking at their abilities, but being able to pick and choose who among them will act at any given moment during the cycle is a very powerful ability, and it's one that the Game Master has as well. So when things are turning against the Game Master, this is something they should consider to keep the challenge up. None of the characters in the Star Wars universe are showing up to the combat to lose. And as much as we might make jokes about things like Stormtroopers not being able to hit anything, that is a very skewed perspective that you as the Game Master should do your best to shed unless you're playing Star Wars very far into the comedic. The Stormtroopers are introduced to us in A New Hope as being precise. Right? Look at those blast points. Only Imperial Stormtroopers are so precise. They normally hit what they're shooting at. It's just that our characters are making them miss. Our characters are avoiding, preempting, interrupting. Right? The characters are special. That's why the Stormtroopers are missing, and you have to keep that in mind as a Game Master, unless you want the Stormtroopers to represent no threat at all. When a squad of Imperial troopers shows up, it should mean something. It can mean something. And when you have different minion groups showing up, mechanically, once the players understand the mechanical effect of a minion group operating together, and once you do, as the Game Master, then that urge to flee the scene becomes a legitimate option for them. It doesn't become something like, wow, I can't believe we're running from Stormtroopers. It's like, holy crap, Stormtroopers have shown up, and we are not in a position, or we do not have the right allies or gear or whatever to handle them. We've got to book it out of here. And that will happen. That does happen. And this is the lowest level of threat. This is the minion. It will likely never be necessary to upgrade your regular Stormtrooper into a rival class threat. Now, you might have a Stormtrooper who is a rival, and that's another kettle of fish. What I'm talking about is the minions by themselves, functioning in groups as they are supposed to, will remain a threat of different kinds. They represent a social threat. Right? This is, the military police being summoned to deal with you as a threat. If you put down enough Stormtroopers, or if you escape enough times from Stormtroopers, they start sending more and more troopers against you with better and better equipment. That's the other aspect. Equipment. Gear is a great leveler, no matter which side you're looking at, both in terms of raising soak and developing defense, but also in terms of output of damage and different types of effects, not just damage. Stun is incredibly useful, and things like nets and entangling devices and communications jammers and whatnot. Gear is incredibly powerful, and because gear is such an unquantifiable and very vast resource, it again becomes very, very challenging to set up an encounter in terms of scripting a set piece or scene. Not to say that you can't do it, but it's challenging. It is a certain amount of work and prediction, very carefully understanding what all the players that are involved in your particular campaign can do when they come together and how those things interact. But the guiding principle of minion, rival, nemesis can still keep you going. Now, like I said, we don't need to worry too much about the minions. The bigger the threat the group becomes, the more likely it is that they'll meet more minions. And it's not a cheat or throwing something easy at the group to face them off with minions. Minions are the class of adversary that they should be facing normally. And a rival is something special. And a rival will grow with the PCs as they engage in their rivalry. And then the most special among their enemies, the nemesis. The nemesis who is maybe almost always off stage, right? Working their plots, surrounded by more active, less capable characters, and of course with the resources of many minion-type characters at their beck and call. Preparing the opposition for use is also easier than it looks. I suppose when you first go to the adversaries chapter and see the array of stat blocks there, it can be daunting. But what that is showing us is just what counts. Now, some game masters will talk about just statting up another PC, which means they're thinking about the opposition being on the rival or nemesis level all the time. We really need to be thinking about the standard opposition being the minion level. That's what we see in the films. We have lots of encounters and interactions, not just combat, with minions. And then there are these high points, these peaks, and if you're approaching the game from the point of view of encounter design, putting specific encounters into play, then this is something you'll need to consider, that generally speaking, what is encountered as a class of opponent is minions and minion groups, sometimes led by a rival. Sometimes rivals will be operating in pairs or independently, and sometimes you will stumble across the plans or even the presence of a nemesis class opponent. So, what the adversaries chapter shows us is like just the facts, man. When you look at those stat blocks, you see everything that you need to know about their characteristics, their most important skills. Everything else is irrelevant. It doesn't apply. This is what we need to see this type of character doing, so that's what's in its stat block. And then there'll be some kind of description of a particular talent or whatnot. You don't need to invest a lot of time and effort hunting down skill trees and spending experience points and figuring out anything like that. You need to give them an iconic ability or two, or a synergistic ability or two that work together in order for them to carry out their task. Are they a merchant in a bazaar? Are they a snowtrooper? Are they a TIE fighter pilot? Whatever they are, make sure they can do that thing. That's all they're in the scene for. That's all you need to worry about when they're minions. When they're rivals, you take more time. You need more care and feeding. But even so, you don't have to go to the extent of turning them into full PCs. Although, if they wind up hanging around and becoming a regular thorn in the side of the PC groups, then you'll start to benefit from that level of care. Now, there are specific instructions and rules and guidance given in the Edge of the Empire screen booklet on experience points for rivals and nemesis. It's something to consider if you're in campaign play and you're having a lot of questions and you don't already have that screen. But really, from the point of view of an experienced game master or a new game master, we have simply, have I used this rival? Is the rival accomplishing some goals or facing some setbacks and challenges? Then they need to benefit from some experience, just like the player characters do. For the nemesis, they are pulling strings. They are in constant motion. They're a very powerful character, able to challenge the whole group of player characters, ostensibly, with their network of allies and minions and whatnot. And so they are constantly being pushed and pulled by the demands of their position, and much like the player characters, are accruing experience points, which should be managed. Once again, focusing on what that character is in the game, in the campaign to do, will help you from that encounter design standpoint. If you are thinking that this character is not a fighter, that they are a manipulator behind the scenes, then make sure they are able to manipulate things behind the scenes, that you don't wind up having to use them as a combat character because they don't have any abilities which keep the player characters away. They don't have a network of spies or agents. They don't have interesting gear. They're not operating out of a location which they can control access and egress, etc., etc. Make sure whatever level of opponent you have, they can do what they're supposed to do. And then as they continue doing that, as your campaign builds, reward them for it. This video is getting long, which I guess is no surprise on this channel. But the last thing we should look at in this overview of encounter design is excitement. This is the Star Wars universe. This particular brand of entertainment, this particular genre, is known for its peaks of excitement. Sometimes people overlook its pits of despair, its moral questions, or the struggles, the day-to-day struggles that are hinted at, sometimes shown directly, of its characters. But it's the excitement, the chases, the peculiar and enormous creatures in places where they shouldn't be, the battles. These are the things which first get mentioned in a conversation with Star Wars. So in encounter design, excitement is key. We don't want our encounters to fall flat. We don't want it to be just another combat. We don't want that feeling to happen ever. And this has much more to do with setting and the context of the scene, I find, than it ever will with the characters who are in play. And I'm not talking about the dramatics of two rival characters coming together or a sudden confrontation with the nemesis that's been building for months and months and months. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the potential for excitement in an encounter tends to be tied more to where they are. Imagine Luke and Vader meeting for that first physical confrontation, and it's not some multi-level dark environment. Imagine it's not happening there. It's happening in the mall. Wide open spaces, kind of a marble floor, and ridiculous shops on either side of them. Imagine that they're meeting in one of those gray boardrooms on the Death Star. Their terrain is a boardroom table and chairs. The excitement level changes dramatically. It's still very dramatic that it's Luke and Vader meeting, but the excitement possible within that scene changes. So be mindful of your surroundings, we hear in the films, and this applies. Once you've set up who or what the characters will be facing, then the next most important question is where. Try to stay away from the how. You don't want it to become something like a formula, something that you are trying to make happen at the table. Try to think about who is there and where they are, and practice yourself some elements of what can happen, right? Using those characters, what can you as the game master do that's interesting tactically, that's interesting emotionally? Where can you go in the environment? What can change in the environment? What will change in the environment after a period of time? What moves in the environment? What could enter the environment? Etc., etc., etc. The environment should be mutable. It should be vast. It should be multiple levels whenever possible. There should be many points of access and egress, some which are not immediately obvious. I don't care what you smell, being a good example. So this is just an overview. This is just the beginning, and this is not a way I normally think about putting scenes together in my Star Wars games, but I know that a lot of people do. I hope this has been at least a little bit helpful, at least as a starter. For people with more experience thinking of the game this way, why not chime in the comments or make a video response? I'll be happy to talk about things with you.